Cops, what's the creepiest thing you found during a house search? Story 1. I spent my first year as a constable in an inner-city suburb of Queensland. Around 40% of the area's population lived in government-commissioned housing designated for rehabilitated criminals and individuals recently released from mental health assessment centers. It was a place with its fair share of unsettling incidents. To be fair, most of the people we dealt with were more like eccentric characters from a cartoon than dangerous individuals, though there were moments when things took a dark turn. One afternoon, a guy we dealt with before completely lost it and started wreaking havoc in his housing complex. He was destroying everything in sight, kicking through fences, throwing potted plants off buildings at random pedestrians, stealing and hoarding people's shoes, and smashing car windows. After about 15 minutes of chaos, he seemed to run out of energy and retreated to his unit. That's where we found him. But instead of calming down, he started screaming and repeatedly bashing his head and face into walls, furniture, and anything else within reach. Eventually, we managed to get him into a secure van and returned to his unit to figure out what had triggered his outburst. The house was in absolute disarray. Somehow he had managed to fit 2 shopping carts inside and was using them as furniture. The smell of rotting food and filth was overwhelming. On a makeshift coffee table were several handwritten notes filled with profanity and a small wooden box. Inside the box were about 100 small clip-seal bags. Over half of them contained a brown granular organic material, while the others held a clear, crystal-like substance. The brown bags were neatly arranged in order of size. In that area, people often found bizarre and dangerous ways to get high. We weren't sure what this substance was, but we had a strong suspicion it was some kind of narcotic. As I examined one of the bags, I emptied its contents into my palm for a closer look. The brown material had flecks of color and tiny hair-like tendrils, consistent with plant derivatives. But I'd never seen anything like it before. I speculated it might be a coarse hash derivative, or even cat, which could explain his erratic behavior. Just then, a dog unit officer who had helped with the arrest walked in. He took one look at the scene, at the bags, at the substance in my hand, and said, "That guy's got golden staph. He's been collecting scabs." It turned out the man had been picking at a golden staph infection on his leg, collecting the scabs, organizing them by size, and eating them. The small yellow crystals, they were dried nasal crust and mucus, all part of his disturbing habit. Story 2. In a tiny, quiet southern town, a horrifying tragedy unfolded. An entire family had been dead in their home for a week before anyone realized. The teenage daughter's boyfriend, whom she'd met online, had traveled across the country to visit her. What followed was unthinkable. The stepfather, mother, daughter, and one of the daughter's friends were brutally murdered and hacked to death with an axe. The mother, a respected professor at a nearby university, had not shown up for work in days. Concerned colleagues contacted the police, who visited the house. They spoke with the murderer, who was still in the home, and managed to give them a plausible excuse for the family's absence. Shockingly, the officers left without investigating further. The killer remained in the house for an entire week before neighbors finally reported the smell. When officers returned, they discovered the gruesome scene. The boyfriend had fled, but they caught him at the airport just as he was about to board a flight home. Story 3. Creepiest. A dead guy. But not just your average deceased person. This man died on his couch, surrounded by no less than 1,500 Miller Lite cans. He had no friends, no family, nobody at all. He was retired, and his electric bill was automatically deducted from his bank account. That's how nobody realized he had passed away. For 5 months, he remained on his couch. When we finally found him, the top half of his body, his front side, was completely skeletonized. But the back of his body, which had been pressed against the couch, was still decomposing with decaying flesh. The sight of a half-skeleton, half-rotting body was unsettling, to say the least. But what was even more disturbing and deeply sad was the realization that this man had left the world and it didn't affect anyone. No one noticed, no one cared. He just disappeared, unnoticed and forgotten. Funniest, we responded to a burglary. As we went through the house with the homeowners, a young married couple, we documented the damage and the items that were missing. When we stepped into the bedroom, there it was, a bright red vibrator lying on the floor. The couple saw it, I saw it, and then we all made eye contact. For the next 5 minutes, we maintained locked eye contact, carefully avoiding any mention of the item in question. Instead, we focused on discussing the broken window, the missing jewelry, and the stolen TV, while all three of us blatantly ignored the elephant, or rather, the vibrator, in the room. Once we finished, we moved on to the living room as if nothing had happened. Story 4. My aunt is a police dispatcher. Usually her job involves answering calls from the public and coordinating nearby officers to respond. But one day she was asked to manage the station's radio because the regular officer in charge was sick. This meant she was the central hub for all communication between officers in the field, handling requests for backup and coordinating responses. That day, she ended up listening to 4 officers talking in a state of panic as 2 squad cars responded to a call about a reported murder. The person who called had been adamant that there were multiple killers present. When the officers arrived, they found something straight out of a horror movie. The victim's flesh had been meticulously cut into 1-inch cubes, as though the perpetrator had planned to fry them or prepare kebabs. The entire body had been disassembled in the same meticulous way. Bones were cut into neat 1-inch segments. Organs were removed, separated, and organized. At one point, one of the officers, clearly overwhelmed, shouted something along the lines of, "This is OCD movie monster bullsh." My aunt initially thought it was all some elaborate prank, but when they called in a hazmat crew to handle the body, she realized it was horrifyingly real. Story 5. Super late to this, but I'll share it anyway. We responded to a call at an apartment that was known to be a local drug den. A woman we knew called, saying the male tenant had been assaulted and that she had fled the scene. When we arrived, the door was bolted shut. I tried to kick it open repeatedly, but it wouldn't budge. Later, I found out that the drug enforcement team had executed a search warrant there a few weeks earlier. And afterward, the tenants had reinforced the door frame with a metal plate. It took me 22 kicks to finally break the deadbolt in half, sending it flying across the room and slamming into the wall. Once we made entry, guns drawn, we began clearing the apartment. The place was straight out of a nightmare. The kind of spooky you only find in homes where meth is heavily used. The walls were covered in disturbing graffiti. Swastikas, 666, upside-down pentagrams, and there were pictures of faces with the eyes crossed out. Baby dolls with their eyes scratched into X's were scattered around. As we cleared the first room, we noticed blood. It was on the bed, then on the floor, forming a trail leading to the back of the apartment. The layout was strange. There was one main room, a narrow hallway acting as a second room, and a bathroom at the very end. We followed the blood trail down the hall and found the tenant's dog in front of the bathroom door. The poor thing was shaking uncontrollably, urinating on the floor, and growling out of pure fear. As we approached, the dog got aggressive, terrified out of its mind. I managed to move past the dog and entered the bathroom. There I found the tenant hunched over in the shower, his face covered in blood, clutching his cheeks with both hands. He was trying to talk, pleading with us not to hurt his dog, but his voice was incomprehensible. Blood dripped from his mouth, and it was only then that I realized the extent of his injuries. Both sides of his jaw had been dislocated when 2 men attacked him with a hammer. His jaw was hanging limp, completely useless. Desperate to communicate, he was flicking his blood-covered tongue to form words since he couldn't move his jaw. It was one of the most disturbing and heartbreaking sights I've ever witnessed. Story 6. My mother used to work for a police department, and when I was homesick from school, I'd sometimes hang out there. One summer, there was an old man who walked every day to the gas station on the corner to buy cigarettes and coffee. When the gas station attendant noticed he hadn't been by for a couple of weeks, she called for a wellness check. When the officers arrived at his home, they knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Then they smelled it, that unmistakable, overwhelming stench. They forced the door open, and the smell hit them like a wall. The officers had to step outside immediately, vomiting from the overpowering odor. Later, they returned with respirators, trash bags, and snow shovels to clean up the sludge that had once been the old man. The summer heat had reduced his body to an unrecognizable state, and it was a scene no one wanted to witness. Another incident almost caused a rookie officer to quit on his very first night. It was a terrible car accident. One car was empty, no driver on the ground, no sign of anyone nearby. The officer thought maybe the driver had walked away, so he started looking for identification inside the vehicle. That's when he found the driver. The man had hit the dashboard so hard that his body had been forced up into the space beneath it. His broken, mangled remains were stuffed around the steering column and other parts of the car. It was a grotesque, almost surreal sight that haunted the officer for a long time. Story 7. I'm not a cop, but a former officer told me this story years ago. I'll let you decide if he was telling the truth or not. The officer had responded to a call from parents asking to have their son arrested. They were convinced he had relapsed on meth. Their suspicion arose after the son started blasting thrash metal and adult content at maximum volume from his bedroom while locking himself inside. Communication with the son was impossible due to the deafening noise. However, the officer's partner managed to peek through the window and saw the son sitting motionless in front of his computer. He appeared shirtless, but otherwise everything seemed relatively normal. With permission from the parents, the officers decided to force open the locked door. As they entered, they were met with a deafening mix of moans and relentless guitar riffs. The only light in the room came from the bluish glow of the computer monitor. The son's face was stretched into a bizarre grin, his lips pulled to their furthest limits. He wasn't just shirtless, he was completely naked and drenched in sweat. And in his right hand, cupped like a chalice, were his testicles. He had torn them off in a frenzy of drug-induced self-mutilation. Story 8. I might be late to the party, but here's my story. I was a new officer with dreams of being a hero. I was dispatched to a call about a family dispute. Not a fight between a husband and wife, but between a brother and sister. The sister reported that her brother had attacked her. When I arrived, I found both of them. I knew the brother from prior encounters. I detained him in handcuffs and immediately noticed the strong smell of pepper spray. I learned that after the brother knocked off the sister's wig, she sprayed him with it. As I walked around the house taking photos to document the property damage, I entered the brother's room and was hit by an incredibly strong odor of pepper spray. My eyes started watering instantly, and the stinging sensation made it hard to breathe. At times, I had to step out of the room to catch my breath. On the walls, I noticed a brownish gel-like substance in the shape of handprints. I took photos of it and assumed it was pepper gel that the suspect had wiped off his face. The substance was everywhere, covering the walls of the room. I thought the sister must have used an entire can of pepper spray on him. After completing my investigation, I took the brother to jail. A few days later, I responded to the same house for an unrelated medical call. More family members were present this time, but the brother was still in custody. While chatting with the family, I asked if they had cleaned up the pepper spray from the brother's room. They gave me a strange look and said there was no pepper spray in there. I explained about the gel on the walls, and then I sat there in horror as they told me the truth. For years, the brother had been, let's just say, leaving his own fluids on the walls and playing with them. What I had thought was pepper spray was, in fact, dried bodily fluids. The fumes that had made the room unbearable were from years of buildup. Story 9. My uncle is a cop and likes to tell the story of the time he went to arrest a 15-year-old who had skipped school to throw rocks at cars and steal items from them. He knew the kid. He'd dealt with him several times before, including incidents involving drugs and once for carrying a knife at school. When they arrived at the house, the 15-year-old's 18-year-old brother and 17-year-old sister answered the door. The officers explained why they were there, but the siblings told them to leave. The cops showed them the arrest warrant and insisted they had to open the door. Instead, they were told to leave again. At that point, another police car arrived, and the officers discussed forcing their way in. That's when the 18-year-old said he had a gun. Within seconds, the officers broke down the door. The 18-year-old was tased. The 17-year-old was screaming for her younger brother, and the 15-year-old took the opportunity to jump out a window and escape, for the time being. The 18-year-old was arrested on the spot, and when the 17-year-old slapped one of the officers, she was arrested too. The officers contacted the property manager and got permission to enter the house to investigate further. The smell on the second floor was unbearable, the worst they'd ever encountered. As they moved upstairs, the odor grew stronger. When they opened a door, they found a long dead body surrounded by needles and drug paraphernalia. They immediately left the scene and called in the appropriate teams. Later, they discovered that the deceased was the kid's grandmother, who had died of an overdose. Their mother was in jail for stabbing a delivery driver, and the kids had never reported the grandmother's death so they could keep cashing her Social Security checks. She had been dead for about a year. My uncle's other creepy stories include a man who tortured animals by feeding them to other animals. Not something like mice to snakes, but things like cats to dogs, or a rabbit to a starving snapping turtle. He also nailed live rodents and cats to boards in his basement and photograph them. Another story involved a drug dealer who killed someone, tried to put the body through a meat grinder, and then fed it to his pit bull. Storytime. I volunteer with the local police department and often go on ride-alongs. My creepiest experience wasn't terrifying, but definitely unsettling. We got a call about squatters in a house scheduled for demolition to make way for a freeway. It sounded like a routine situation. Kick them out, move on. It was just before sunset, and the house was in a residential neighborhood, fenced off and abandoned. But this wasn't just any abandoned house. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. The building resembled an old schoolhouse, complete with a rusty metal swing set and a scarecrow standing near the fence. There were crosses scattered around the yard, and the boarded-up windows were covered in writing. People had scrawled strange and unsettling messages like, "This place belongs to us," and other cryptic, creepy phrases. The property included a main house, a garage, and a cellar. The cellar was the worst part, a wooden door leading underground with creaky old steps. If you went down, you'd find yourself in a concrete basement with small windows that showed nothing but dirt outside. There were old beds and furniture scattered around, but it looked like it had been abandoned for years. The entire place had an oppressive atmosphere, and the longer we stayed, the more unsettling it became. It was like the setting of a horror film come to life. Even though it wasn't dangerous, the sheer eeriness of the place made it hard to shake off. If this story gets any attention, I might even drive over and take some pictures. It's still there. Story 11. In a law class I was taking, the professor brought in a police officer to discuss legal concepts. At one point, the officer showed the class a photo of a man who had died by suicide with a gun and asked, "Can you tell what color his eyes are?" The class stared blankly, unsure how to answer. After a moment, the officer joked, "Blue. One blew this way, the other blew that way." The class groaned at the dark humor. I raised my hand and asked, "Obviously, you have thicker skin about this sort of thing than we do. Have you ever seen anything that got to you?" The cop's expression grew serious, and he shared a story that left the room silent. He told us about a local family with two young brothers. Every Saturday morning, the older brother would wake up early, make toast, and sit with his younger brother in front of the TV to eat and watch cartoons together. One Saturday, the older brother decided to sleep in, so the younger one took it upon himself to make toast. The boy went into the kitchen, put bread in the toaster, and pressed the lever. He didn't notice how close the toaster was to the window curtains. The curtains caught fire, and soon the entire house was engulfed in flames. The parents barely managed to escape with the older brother, but by the time the officer arrived, the younger boy had passed away. The officer explained that the boy must have set the toaster and gone back to the living room to wait for his brother. The heat caused a nearby window to collapse and melt around him as he sat in the living room. At the time, the officer had two boys around the same age as the brothers in the story. He said he had to excuse himself from the scene, retreat to his squad car, and couldn't stop crying or shaking. As he shared the story with the class, he started crying again. Story 12. I'm Australian and worked in a remote area, which meant encountering some unusual situations. One night, we were called to a drunken dispute where a firearm had been discharged. Our entire patrol group, 4 or 5 officers, responded to the call. When we arrived, we found the firearm. My partner went to unload it and quickly realized it had no trigger. Upon closer inspection, we discovered the safety was actually being used as the trigger. It was a bizarre setup, but the gun was secured. Since no one in the house was licensed to own firearms, we began searching for additional weapons or ammunition. In Australia, you're not supposed to have guns unless you have a valid reason. The house was in a terrible state. Dog feces on the floor, dirty diapers everywhere. For some reason, I decided to open the fridge. In hindsight, it wasn't the smartest idea given the condition of the place. When I opened the door, I found myself staring at a kangaroo's upper half, paws outstretched as if frozen mid-reach. It was on the top shelf. On the next shelf down was the rest of the kangaroo, its tail hanging off the edge of the middle shelf. The smell was unbearable. The fridge light was on, but I wasn't convinced it was actually working. I slammed the door shut quickly, overwhelmed by the odor. Naturally, the most reasonable thing to do was move across the room and yell at my partner to check the fridge. It wasn't particularly creepy, just very unusual. I was relatively new on the job at the time, and it was one of those moments that stuck with me. Story 13. I'm a former law enforcement officer and have two stories. The first one involves a call we received about a woman whose daughter couldn't reach her. Calls like this often end badly. When we arrived at the house, the daughter gave us written permission to force entry. She waited by the squad car while we had the fire department pry open the door. As soon as we entered, the smell was overwhelming. We began searching the house and found the mother in the kitchen, lying on the open door of the oven. Half of her face and hair were burned, and the oven was still on. The daughter later told us that the mother used the oven for heat and must have had a heart attack, falling onto the oven door. The sight was haunting. Her injuries reminded me of Harvey Dent from the Batman films. The second story was the scariest call I ever responded to. Dispatch received a report of a woman screaming from an abandoned apartment, claiming she was being tortured or killed. My partner, 4 other officers, and I had to search every room in what looked like an old college dorm. The doors all faced inward, and we had no way of knowing where the screams were coming from. Eventually, my partner found the woman, covered in blood, running out of an apartment. I stayed at the door while he chased her down. When we finally searched the apartment, we discovered she was high on PCP and had been cutting herself. At the time, we had no way of knowing that. The search felt like something out of a horror movie. I half expected to find Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger behind every door. Story 14. Some guys were off-roading near a remote lake in an old topless Ford Bronco without a windshield. The vehicle rolled, throwing everyone out except for the driver. It was a remote area, so it took us some time to get there. When I arrived, everyone who could move was kneeling near the Bronco. As I approached, I heard agonizing screams coming from underneath the vehicle. Shining my flashlight under the Bronco, I saw the driver's face. His head had been severely deformed from the weight of the vehicle, but he was still alive and screaming. The fire department was still a few minutes away, and we had no equipment to lift the vehicle off him. The others had been trying to lift it themselves and had resorted to digging. The helplessness in those moments was unbearable. His screams eventually turned to faint moans and then stopped altogether. He passed away before we could get him out. That was my first year as a police officer. Later that night, I had to notify his wife about his death. It was incredibly difficult not to break down crying in front of her. She asked for more details, but all I could think about were his screams. I didn't tell her what we had seen. Those screams stayed with me for years, waking me up at night. Over time, they were replaced by other tragedies, but I've never forgotten that night. Story 15. I heard this one from my dad, who worked for a restoration company that had a contract with the city to respond to certain emergencies. The police had been called to do a welfare check on a woman whose family hadn't heard from her in over a week. When they arrived, they could see her lying near the front door through a window. They broke down the back door to get in and discovered she had passed away some time ago. My dad's company was called in to board up the broken door. He arrived before the body was removed and was disturbed by the sight. She was bloated and in a bad state. My dad had never seen a dead body outside of a funeral before. The fire chief on the scene noticed his discomfort and asked if it was his first time seeing something like that. When my dad said yes, the chief shared a story about the worst thing he had ever seen. The incident involved a man who was visibly upset while arguing on his phone. After hanging up, the man threw his phone on the ground, walked onto a highway, and jumped in front of an oncoming 16-wheeler. The truck driver couldn't stop in time, and every single wheel ran over him. When the fire chief arrived, there were body parts scattered everywhere. He assumed the man had died instantly, but as he approached the largest part of the body, he heard faint breathing. The man was still alive. The chief immediately tried to perform CPR, but as soon as he touched the man's face, his head collapsed, like a rotting pumpkin. Story 16. I'm not a cop, but I used to work as a contractor cleaning up after deaths. My high school psychology teacher once shared a story about a job he took in Louisiana that made him change his career entirely. He and his partner were called to clean up a sewage scene. A man had taken his own life in the attic of his home about a week earlier using a crossbow. When they arrived, they suited up in hazmat gear and headed upstairs to the attic. As soon as they entered the room, they were hit by the overwhelming stench of decomposition. Even through the hazmat suits, the moist, heavy air made him gag. The man had sat on a box, aimed the crossbow at his own head, and fired, pinning himself to the wall behind him. As they began the process of removing the crossbow bolt, the man's severely bloated body couldn't handle the disturbance. It exploded, sending decomposed fluids and tissue all over the room and covering both of them in the mess. The mixture of the smell and the experience was too much for him. Needless to say, he chose a different career path shortly after that. Story 17. A few years ago, we were sent on a wellness check for an elderly woman living alone in a rough part of the city. From what I remember, she didn't have any family or friends, and a wellness aide was the one who called it in. No one had heard from her in a few days. We arrived and knocked on the door repeatedly, announcing ourselves, but got no response. We contacted the property manager, who came with a key to let us in. When we opened the door, we found her on the floor, clearly deceased. Her face was frozen in an expression of fear and pain, and one of her feet was detached from her leg, lying about a meter away from her body. Blood was everywhere. At first, I assumed she had been murdered. The scene was shocking, and adrenaline kicked in immediately. But after taking a closer look and piecing things together, we realized what had happened. She had been trying to adjust her blinds and grabbed a chair from the kitchen to stand on. She must have lost her balance, fallen, and landed in such a way that her foot snapped clean off. She then crawled around the room, bleeding heavily, until she eventually passed out and died. I've seen worse scenes over the years, but this one sticks with me. I can't even begin to imagine what was going through her mind in her final moments. Alone, in pain, and unable to call for help. Story 18. Time to share my story, creepiest or funniest, you decide. We conducted a search at a motorcycle clubhouse that was notorious for criminal activity. We had received an anonymous tip that they were hiding illegal firearms there, which are strictly prohibited in my country. We breached the door and began the search. About half an hour in, no one had found anything substantial. I decided to check the ceiling tiles, the kind you can easily lift. I pushed one up and peeked inside, but it was too dark to see anything, so I asked a colleague for a flashlight. When I shined the light into the space, I felt a surge of excitement. I spotted a black bag hidden up there. My first thought was, jackpot, we've got the guns. I moved directly underneath the spot, pulled the bag down and shouted, "Got 'em, guys!" Everyone gathered around as I placed the bag on the ground. At least 8 of my colleagues were standing there, waiting to see what we'd found. When I opened the bag, I was completely stunned. It wasn't guns. The bag was full of dildos. But these weren't ordinary ones. Some were at least 60 centimeters long and massive. A few of them even looked used. We all burst into laughter. After finishing the search and finding nothing else of interest, we left the clubhouse. Before leaving, I made sure to leave the bag in plain sight for the motorcycle club members. I can only imagine which member had hidden it up there and how awkward it must have been for them when they found it. Story 19. I'm not a cop, but I once ended up in a drug den a few years ago. Completely by accident. I was accompanying a friend while he ran some errands. He didn't have a car and asked me for a ride, saying it would only take about 30 minutes to deliver something. I didn't know it was going to be a drug deal until it was too late. We entered the drug den, and the atmosphere immediately unsettled me. The place was dark, with only one light source. A car battery rigged to power a single bulb tied to wires hanging from the ceiling. The people inside ranged from the lowest of the low to wealthy individuals wearing formal attire, like barong shirts, which are traditionally worn by lawyers and politicians in my country. As we walked through the space, we passed people openly smoking meth. At one point, I saw into an open room where 3 people were engaged in disturbing behavior, not in any way glamorous or hot, but just messy and unsettling. At the end of the hall, my friend entered a room where 6 people were already in the middle of a drug session. He delivered whatever he had brought and decided to stick around to take a few hits himself. Then they turned to me and asked if I wanted to join. I declined, but they persisted. "Do it. Come on, it's not that bad," they said over and over. I was terrified. I didn't know what would happen if I kept saying no. I felt like my life could be in danger if I upset them. So I took a hit but didn't actually inhale the smoke. I just let it touch my mouth and immediately blew it out. It was like pretending to smoke as a beginner, and thankfully they didn't seem to notice. We stayed for another 20 to 30 minutes, and it felt like an eternity. At one point, 2 children, probably around 3 to 6 years old, wandered into the room. They went up to their parents like it was completely normal to be in that environment. It broke my heart to think these kids might grow up believing drug use was just a part of life. As the session continued, the group began discussing a recent drug raid where one of their friends had been gunned down. At that moment, I felt a new wave of fear. I started worrying that the police might storm the den at any second, and I'd end up arrested as a drug user. Finally, I convinced my friend to leave. I drove him to the nearest gas station, dropped him off, and didn't say much. I was furious. When I got home, I blocked all communication with him and never saw him again. Later, I anonymously reported the drug den to the police, but I have no idea what happened after that. Story 20. Not as creepy or disturbing as some of the stories here, but I have a few to share. I live in a small town, so we don't get much excitement. I'm friends with the local sheriff, so I hear all the gossip and occasionally get access to crime scenes. First story. There's an elderly couple who lived deep in the woods. One night, three men broke into their home intending to rob them. When the couple refused to give the combination to their safe, the intruders dragged them into the basement. They tied the couple to a pole and beat them. Then they poured gasoline on them and set them on fire. The smell was horrifying and lingered for days. Second story. There's a house in town where a family was murdered about 20 years ago. Afterward, the house went up for sale and was eventually purchased by someone I knew casually. I once went over to his house for some kind of gathering. I can't even remember why, as we weren't really friends. While there, I discovered he still had the chalk outlines of the victims' bodies preserved in the basement. Third story. I used to be good friends with the son of the old town sheriff. When I'd visit their house, there was one room in the middle of the house that was always locked. It was a large room, and the sheriff was often in there, but he never allowed anyone else inside, not even his son. Years later, the sheriff passed away from cancer, and his family finally opened the room. Inside, there was a fully stocked bar, but the most bizarre thing was the mannequins. Dozens of them, all fully dressed, positioned as though they were interacting with one another. It looked like a scene frozen in time. The whole thing gave me chills. Story 21. As a detective, my partner and I were called out late one night to investigate the drowning of a 2-year-old in a bathtub. When we arrived, we found 6 children in the house, all under the age of 9, but no adults. We separated the kids and interviewed them individually. The first 2 I spoke with didn't have much to say. "Mom is gone. We never know when she'll be back. I don't have a dad. I was asleep." It was basic, fragmented information. When I went to get the third child, my partner was still speaking with his first, a 5-year-old girl. My partner looked pale, almost like he'd seen a ghost, while the little girl remained calm and matter-of-fact. The 5-year-old explained what had happened. The 2-year-old wouldn't stop crying. She said she tried to make him stop, but he kept crying again and again. Finally, she decided to run a bath. She placed the toddler in the tub and held his head underwater until he stopped fighting. Then she got herself a bowl of dry cereal because she was hungry. She recounted all of this without a hint of emotion, as though it was just another normal day. It was one of those cases where all you want to do is go home and hug your kids. In the end, 2 adults were charged with child neglect, and the state took custody of the children. Unfortunately, the juvenile prosecutor decided not to charge the 5-year-old with a crime. While she wasn't criminally responsible, juvenile court could have been an opportunity to ensure she received counseling or therapy, something to address what had happened and the circumstances she'd grown up in. Story 22. I'm not a police officer, but I work as a security officer at a casino, and you wouldn't believe the things we see in this line of work. This story happened over 6 months ago. We got a call about someone overdosing in one of the hotel rooms. EMTs and 5 of us security officers were dispatched, us to locate and detain any suspects fleeing the scene. When the EMTs arrived at the room, the victim's boyfriend opened the door. He claimed his girlfriend was lying on the bed, naked and packed with ice. Then he bolted, along with her best friend, her best friend's boyfriend, and 2 other people. The EMTs began working on the girl while the rest of us spread out in mobile units to find the fleeing group. 4 of them tried to escape on foot, running over the levee, but they were quickly stopped. My partner and I cut through a parking lot and managed to catch the boyfriend. He was cuffed, placed in a vehicle, and brought over to the police, who had already detained the other 4. The boyfriend was covered in neo-Nazi tattoos, including teardrops, an SS emblem, swastikas, and spiderweb designs, all prison ink. When the police searched him, they found 2 loaded handguns, a Bowie knife, a stiletto knife, and other weapons in his backpack, along with 150 rounds of ammunition. Meanwhile, the victim's best friend had everyone's drugs and paraphernalia stuffed in her purse. Inside, officers found 2.58 balls, half an ounce of meth, 2 grams of hero, 3.5 ounces of weed, about 50 Percocet oxycodone pills, a prescription for Xanax, and numerous needles. The boyfriend started ranting about how the Brotherhood would take care of him in prison. Needless to say, all 5 suspects were arrested and taken to the local police station. Back in the hotel room, the EMTs managed to resuscitate the girl, but she was left with a very weak pulse. She was taken to the hospital but tragically became brain dead and was later taken off life support. After everyone was in custody, we went back into the room with detectives. It was like something out of a horror movie. The presidential suite's bathroom had 5 chairs arranged in a circle, with incense still burning. Belts, tourniquets, and needles were scattered everywhere. The bed was soaked where the girl had been lying, packed in ice. The creepiest part? There were swastikas, a B, Aryan Brotherhood, and white power written in blood on every mirror. The room also contained 5 copies of Mein Kampf. It was one of the strangest and most disturbing calls I've ever experienced at work. Story 23. This didn't happen to me, but a good friend of mine responded to a home invasion call and told me this story. The homeowner was an obsessive collector of World War I memorabilia. He had an entire collection of German soldier helmets, enough for a full company. The collector knew the history of each one, who the soldier was, where they were from, and even how and when they died. The helmets were displayed on plaster head statues, and the ones belonging to deceased soldiers were crying because of the way plaster absorbs moisture over time. My friend swears this is a thing, but I've never seen it and think he might be exaggerating. Downstairs, the collector had 2 life-size statues of British soldiers in full combat gear. What made it eerie was that he had collected the original kits and items of these soldiers, minus personal effects that had been returned to families. But it didn't stop there. The collector had reconstructed the faces of the mannequins to perfectly match the real soldiers. He had used recruiting documents and photographs to ensure the faces were as accurate as possible. The level of dedication and obsession was astonishing, and it freaked my friend out. He said one of the mannequins was positioned in a kneeling shooting stance, directly facing the stairs. He joked that he almost put a few bullet holes in its uniform when he first saw it. The funny part? The burglar ignored the millions of dollars worth of WWI memorabilia and stole an Xbox, a TV, 2 laptops, and a toaster oven instead. Story 24. My uncle, who used to be a cop, like my father, told me a story about a man who died in a motel room. The man had a heart attack while sitting on the toilet, similar to Elvis, and his body went unnoticed for some time. Eventually, neighbors began complaining to the front desk about a foul odor coming from the room next door. The motel staff discovered the man's body, and the coroner was called in to handle the situation. While attempting to remove the body from the toilet, the coroner and the team accidentally broke through the man's decomposing skin. The weight of his lower body caused it to separate from the top half. My uncle said the smell was something he would never forget. He also shared a story about a motorcycle accident. The rider wasn't wearing a helmet, and the aftermath of the accident left the scene in a condition you can probably imagine. Later in his career, my uncle worked as a prison warden, and he said he saw everything there: violence, gang activity, and even murders. My dad, on the other hand, rarely shares stories. One of the few he told me involved finding a body in an alleyway during winter. The cause of death was yet another heart attack. Story 25. When I asked my dad about the worst things he'd experienced during his time in the police force, I didn't expect to hear some of the most shocking stories of my life. He often responded to calls as the first officer on the scene after a death was reported. Many cases were relatively straightforward: elderly people who passed away from heart attacks or other natural causes. But occasionally the circumstances were far more unusual. For instance, there was the case of an elderly man who had fallen asleep in the bathtub. He had a heating element in the water to keep it warm, and when he passed away, the heat kept running. By the time his daughter found him 2 weeks later, his body had essentially slow cooked. My dad described it as a human crock pot without a lid. Then there was the story that was even worse. He was called to a house where an elderly man had returned from the pub, had a stroke, and died while lying down in front of an electric fireplace. The man's wife, who suffered from advanced Alzheimer's disease, had no understanding of what had happened. Over the next 2 weeks, she brought him plates of toast, crumpets, beans on toast, and cups of tea, arranging them around his body as if he were still alive. When the officers arrived, the woman didn't recognize her husband. She alternated between referring to him as her boyfriend, a guest, or even the gas man. They had been married for 40 years. When my dad and his colleagues began to remove the man's body, they discovered it was so decomposed that the flesh slipped off the bone whenever they tried to lift him. The smell was indescribable, and the scene was one of the most disturbing my dad had ever encountered. Hearing these stories helped me understand my dad a little better. why he's so bitter at times and why he can be difficult. I have a girlfriend who wants to study forensic science, which I think is incredible. But after hearing my dad's stories, I know it's not something I could ever do. Story 26. I'm not a cop, but I competed in TPSA, Texas Public Service Association, and Skills USA law enforcement competitions. During those events, we got to practice building clearing with local officers and even a SWAT team. Tony Tamari. They'd set up realistic scenarios for us, using simulation guns and sometimes staging situations like domestic disturbance calls. One time we were doing a building clearing drill. I was moving down a long, dark hallway with no lights. My flashlight was the only thing giving me any visibility. Suddenly, I heard heavy but hesitant footsteps coming toward me. Out of the darkness, a girl appeared, her hands up, breathing heavily and acting hysterical. She was saying something about a guy in the back of the building with a gun. I could feel my heart racing, even though I knew this was just a training scenario. As I tried to look past her, trying to assess the situation, she suddenly sprinted toward me, holding one of the rubber knives we used in training. Before I even had a chance to react, she stabbed me in the chest. Needless to say, I nearly jumped out of my skin. The entire team burst into laughter, and it quickly became one of the most talked about moments from training. Even though it was all just practice, the adrenaline and immersion made it feel very real in the moment. Story 27. This story was told to me by a guy I apprenticed for. He used to be a police officer in New Jersey during the 1980s. One day, he and his partner were sent to do a welfare check on a 90-year-old woman who hadn't been heard from in some time. When they arrived, there was no response to their knocking, so they decided to circle the property. My mentor looked through a back window and thought he saw the woman floating. The glass was rippled and blurry, but it looked like she had hung herself. They tried the nearest door, which turned out to be unlocked, and entered the home. When they turned on the kitchen lights, they found her. She was dead, with her lower jaw impaled on the sharp, arrowhead-shaped handle of a Spanish-style iron cabinet. It seemed that she had been standing on the counter, trying to reach something when she slipped. The pointed handle pierced under her chin and into her jaw, leaving her suspended. Removing her body proved difficult because of how the handle was designed. It was too sharp and too deeply embedded for them to simply lift her off. It was the 1980s in Jersey City, and they didn't have the tools to cut through iron readily available. After several failed attempts to jiggle her jaw off the handle, my mentor made a decision. He took out a combat knife, sawed her jaw off at the hinges, and then split the remaining jaw in half to remove it. As grim as it was the only way they could free her. He always told this story to illustrate the harsh realities of being on the job during that time. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't for the faint of heart. Story 29. A police captain I know always shares this story about a search warrant he executed on a father and son. When officers arrived at the house, they were immediately hit by a revolting smell. Many of the officers said it resembled the stench of decomposition. After several minutes of attempting to make contact with anyone inside, the front door was forced open. As the team entered the house and began their search, the source of the smell became clear. In a back room, officers found the son. He was completely naked, covered in filth, and surrounded by over 50 buckets filled with human waste. Shockingly, he was in the process of consuming the contents of one of the buckets. He appeared emaciated, his body resembling a skeleton. The son was detained and escorted out of the room, where officers discovered a similar situation in another room with the father. Both men were eventually seated on the floor as the team tried to process what they were witnessing. Then the son suddenly shouted, "Dad, I have to go!" The father responded, "Just go on the floor. Show them, son." At that point, the son began defecating on the floor in a frenzy, causing chaos as officers tried to subdue him. Meanwhile, the father encouraged him and even attempted to interact with the mess. Eventually, the officers managed to restrain both men and get them into squad cars. Further searches of the home revealed over 100 buckets filled with human waste scattered throughout the property. The scene was one of the most bizarre and disturbing situations the captain had ever encountered in his career. Story 30. I'm not a cop, but I worked for my friend's dad back in high school around 2001. He bought old, rundown houses and renovated them into rental properties. One of the houses we were assigned to gut belonged to an elderly woman who had passed away. From what we were told, she had died in the middle of summer and wasn't discovered until the neighbors complained about the smell. We entered the house about a month after her death, and it still reeked. Someone had already removed the chair and carpet from the room where she died, so we couldn't figure out why the odor was still so strong. The smell was unforgettable, like a mix of ammonia, feces, garbage, and rotting meat. We opened all the windows, but it didn't help. We started poking around, as usual, to see if anything had been left behind. The house still had most of its furniture, dressers, tables, and other pieces. It seemed like the family had grabbed the essentials and left the rest, probably because of the smell. We checked the attic and found a box of old Playboys from the 1980s, some fireworks that didn't work, and other odds and ends. Nothing too unusual. But when we made our way to the basement, we found the source of the smell. As soon as we opened the basement door, the odor hit us like a wall. From the top of the stairs, we could see that the floor was damp, but it wasn't water. One of my buddies went down to check it out and came running back up, gagging and heaving. The basement was filled with 20 to 30 rotting cat carcasses, along with several clean cat skeletons. It looked like the woman had been keeping cats in the basement as prisoners. The floor was covered in years' worth of cat feces, and the smell was beyond unbearable. We figured the house must have smelled bad, even before she passed away. Story 31. Clearing a house where you're expecting to find a body is one of the scariest things. You never know what state the body will be in, where it might be, or how you'll react. Every time you're 100% convinced a zombie will jump out and eat your face off. The first time I encountered this was with a well-to-do man who had taken his own life in his backyard swimming pool. When I first spotted him from a distance, I couldn't bring myself to get closer for about 5 minutes. Eventually, I worked up the nerve and walked over, trying to stay as far back as possible so I wouldn't accidentally fall in. As I got closer, the body released gas, sending up bubbles in the water. Naturally, I let out a squeal, thinking for a split second that he was still alive. He wasn't. Of course, my team had a good laugh at my expense. Another time, we caught a burglar who had broken into a jewelry store with an accomplice. They had staked out the place for hours in the fire escape after it closed. When we apprehended him, I started going through his backpack. There was a strong smell like dirty, wet feet, but I didn't think much of it at first. Many crooks have a distinct odor from their lifestyle. As I rummaged through the bag, I found a heavy package wrapped inside 2 gardening gloves. When I unwrapped it, I was horrified. The burglar had relieved himself in a sock while waiting in the fire escape. He'd wrapped it up to avoid leaving any DNA evidence behind. Let's just say that was one of the more unpleasant discoveries I've made during a search. Story 32. I'm not a cop, but my roommate is a first responder. A few years back, the local Indian reservation was dealing with a significant crack coca problem. Everyone knew who the main drug dealer was, but law enforcement had their hands tied due to jurisdictional issues between the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the tribal police. The tribal police also had their own problems, including corruption, like having a convicted pedophile working as an officer. Since no one in law enforcement seemed willing to take the dealer down, some tribal members decided to handle it themselves. One night, my roommate was working EMS when they got a call to respond to the dealer's house on the reservation. When he and his partner arrived, the property was surrounded by armed police officers, guns drawn. They had to wait for the property to be cleared before entering. Once given the all clear, they were told there were 2 casualties inside, likely both deceased, but they still needed to be checked by paramedics before the coroner could be called. My roommate grabbed his bag and walked into the house. The living room was dimly lit by the glow of the TV, which was still on. Sitting in an armchair, feet up and remote in hand, was the dealer. His entire face was gone from multiple gunshots to the head. Despite knowing it was futile, my roommate checked for a pulse. There was none. He was then directed to another room, where the dealer's underage girlfriend lay on the floor. She had been shot so many times in the torso that the only thing holding her body together was her spinal column. It was immediately clear that she was beyond saving, and my roommate told the officers to call the coroner. What stuck with him the most wasn't the violence itself. He'd seen plenty in his line of work, but the eerie scene of the dealer still sitting in his chair, the laugh track from the TV show playing in the background. He said it felt like something out of a horror movie. As far as he knows, no one was ever arrested for the murders, but everyone seemed to have a good idea of who was responsible for ridding the community of its drug lord. Story 33. I think I'm late to this, but here's my story. My mom worked for the PSNI Police Service of Northern Ireland, and she once told me about a call she responded to on a country road. In Ireland, people tend to drive like maniacs on these narrow roads, so accidents aren't uncommon. One early morning, A woman was out jogging when one of these reckless drivers hit her. The impact sent her flying. And when police arrived, they found most of what was left of her tangled in the branches of the trees lining the road. Another case, while less gruesome, was still unsettling. A woman walking her dog along a main road near where I used to live was struck by a car. Two drivers had been racing down the road, and one of them hit her. That driver stopped and was visibly distraught when the police arrived, overwhelmed with guilt. The other driver, however, sped off without stopping. Later, while the investigation was still ongoing, the second driver drove past the scene from the other direction. He craned his neck to get a good look at the aftermath, as though he weren't equally responsible for the tragedy. What stuck with my mom the most was the woman's dog. It survived the crash and ran off, terrified and confused. When the officers went to inform the woman's husband about her death, they also had to tell him that the dog had been found alive. My mom said she couldn't imagine how anyone processes that kind of news. Losing a loved one in such a sudden, senseless way. Story 34. My cousin was a police officer in St. Louis, and one Christmas, he was called out for a welfare check by the son of an elderly woman. The son led him into the house, and my cousin began searching room by room. After clearing the entire house, the only place left to check was the basement. He opened the basement door and noticed the light was out, so he had to use his flashlight to see as he descended the stairs. At the bottom of the stairs, he scanned the room in a 360-degree sweep, both to check for safety hazards and to locate a light switch. By the time he'd turned about 270 degrees, he came face to face with the woman he was searching for. She was dead, but somehow still standing. Her body was wedged between a wall and a dresser, propped up by the dresser itself. Her head was hanging forward, and her hair was draped over her face. He said it was the single creepiest thing he had ever seen in his career. Story 35. I'm not a cop, but I used to work at a music store when I was in high school. One day my boss told me a bizarre story about something that happened a few years before I started working there. The music store had apartments above it, and a young guy who worked across the street at a bike shop used to live in one of them. The owner of the bike shop started getting suspicious after noticing that bike parts were disappearing from the store. Eventually, the owner discovered that the young employee was sneaking back into the bike shop after hours, stealing parts, selling them, and pocketing the money. The police got involved and went to search the young man's apartment above the music store. After wrapping up their investigation, they asked the bike shop owner if anything else besides parts had gone missing. The owner replied, "Come to think of it, there was a mannequin in the window that disappeared one day, and I haven't been able to find it." The police responded, "Oh, we found that. You probably don't want it back." When they searched the apartment, they found the mannequin in the young man's bed, with a rubber attachment glued to it. Story 36. These stories come from my father-in-law, who served 30 years as a police officer after a career in the military. One case that stood out involved a 21-year-old woman who had been dead in her bathtub for nearly a week. There wasn't any water in the tub. She had a seizure while pulling up her underwear, fell, hit her head, and ended up in the tub. By the time the coroner arrived, her body was so badly decomposed due to the Texas heat that they initially thought they were dealing with a woman over 50 and of a different race. It wasn't until they went through her belongings that they identified her correctly. Another unforgettable case was the suicide of a young man. He had been dumped by his girlfriend and had been relentlessly texting her until, one day, the messages stopped. Worried, the girlfriend called for a wellness check. When my father-in-law and EMS arrived, they found that he had hanged himself. He had been there for so long that his neck had stretched 8 to 10 inches. My father-in-law also mentioned that the faces of individuals who hang themselves can be particularly unsettling, especially after extended periods. He said things involving soldiers or veterans were often the most intense, especially cases involving severe PTSD. Flashbacks and hallucinations could make these situations downright eerie. Not all stories were as grim, though. Drunk encounters sometimes bordered on absurd. Once he pulled over a woman who intentionally hiked up her skirt while going commando. Instead of dealing with it himself, he sent a rookie to handle the situation, complete with her overgrown surprise. The rookie wasn't thrilled and held it against him for a while. There are countless other stories, but these are the ones that stand out the most in this context. Story 37. Back in the day, I somehow landed a regional manager job at a moving company. My first assignment involved moving a girl whose out-of-town mother had hired us. The mother had paid for everything, so it was just me, my buddy, we were both about 20, and the girl being moved. She was in her early 20s and moving into her friend's parents' house. When we arrived, we quickly realized the mother should have hired someone to clean the place first. The apartment was a disaster, one step away from being a full-blown hoarder's home. There was barely a carved-out path from the front door to the bedroom. Dishes with weeks-old food, trash everywhere, and items that should have been thrown out months ago were scattered throughout the studio. We packed everything up while she worked on her bedroom. After loading the U-Haul, we made our way to her friend's parents' house. It was located in the hills on narrow, winding roads, and the driveway barely had space to maneuver the truck. To properly set up the ramp, I had to position the truck at a slight tilt toward the back. As we started unloading, disaster struck. The boxes she had packed weren't sealed properly, some weren't even folded closed. One of them tipped and outpoured her entire collection of adult toys. The sheer size of the collection was, in a way, impressive. It was as if she had dedicated herself to being a connoisseur of her craft. Her friend's parents stood there stunned, while my buddy and I exchanged looks, unsure of what to do. Do we help her pick everything up? Do we focus on moving other boxes to distract from the situation? Or do we crack a joke like, "Looks like you could use a hand," or a friend? Ultimately, she rushed over to gather everything herself, clearly embarrassed. It's not the unusual items people own that surprise me. It's how they react when those items are discovered. Story 38. I'm not a cop, paramedic, or anything like that, but I had a strange experience a couple of years ago when I was part of the Boy Scouts. I was going door to door selling wreaths to raise money for an upcoming trip. I remember one house I approached feeling instantly off. The woman who answered the door looked completely worn down, tears in her eyes and an expression of utter defeat. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should even start my pitch, but eventually I began. Halfway through, I could hear a man yelling somewhere deeper in the house. As the yelling grew louder, the woman's demeanor shifted. Her worry and fear became more apparent with each passing second. Just as I finished my pitch, the man's shouting was close enough to be alarming. The woman let out a half cry, stepped back in pain or fear, and closed the door. I stepped off the driveway slowly, hearing a commotion from inside the house as I walked away. It was unsettling and unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. The next day, on the bus ride home from school, I saw 2 squad cars parked in front of that same house. 2 police officers were outside, interrogating a man on the driveway. To this day, I have no idea what happened in that house, but it was one of the most unsettling moments of my life. Story 39. I'm not a cop, and this isn't particularly creepy, just an odd experience. Back when I was still in the early stages of dating my now fiancée, she came home one day to find her apartment door had been kicked in. Too scared to go inside, she called me first. I told her to stay down the hall, keeping an eye on the door in case someone was still inside. She then called 911. I arrived first, carrying my concealed weapon with me, and we waited outside her apartment door for about 2 minutes until a single police officer arrived to respond to the home invasion call. When the officer got there, he asked if we were the ones who called and what had happened. We explained the situation and mentioned the break-in. I also let him know I was armed. Without hesitation, the officer asked if I wanted to help him clear the apartment. I wasn't expecting that at all, but I agreed. As he went through the apartment room by room, I stood by as his backup, ensuring no one jumped out at him. Thankfully, the apartment was empty and nothing had been taken. The whole situation was surreal and completely opposite of what I had expected to happen. Then again, I do live in Texas, so I guess that's just how things go here sometimes.